Welcome back. This module will cover taxi and takeoff. As in the rest of our videos, make sure you have time to watch this module, make sure you have the crew day, and have reviewed all publications, especially the applicable pages in the FTI. Don't forget, you can always use the pause button if you need to review the content. By the end of this module, you should be able to understand the terminology, restrictions, and procedures related to taxiing, be able to apply basic ground communications during taxi and takeoff, and understand the parameters and procedures for takeoff. When you're ready to taxi from the ramp, you must obtain clearance from ground control. Ensure you understand local SOP prior to requesting that clearance, as procedures may be different at your home base. The basic format of this call will consist of the agency being called, the aircraft call sign, your position on the airport, usually the name of the parking line, IFR or VFR in accordance with your planned operation, and your destination. In contacts, this will typically be a working area. On an out and in, it may be an airfield outside of the local area. For example, Navy Corpus Ground, Boomer 737, Bravo line, taxi with Charlie, Kings 4, VFR. Ground control will reply with specific routing to get to the engine run-up area or the active runway. At unfamiliar airfields, ensure you have the airport diagram open and available to identify the routing. For your local training base, there will be specific guidance in your SOP for the routing to get from the parking area to the run-ups and active runways. These routes should be studied and memorized prior to your flight. Ground control instructions do not clear you to cross any runway unless specifically stated, cleared to cross runway 5. Clearance to the hold short of an active runway, called a restricted clearance, will be common in your training. Again, clearance to cross any runway must be explicitly stated. For example, at Navy Corpus, the aircraft aprons are off of Charlie line. Your clearance to the engine run-ups might be Texan 737, taxi to the run-ups via Charlie, Sierra, and then after completing the run-up, the further taxi clearance might be Texan 737, runway 13 right, taxi via Sierra, Charlie, runway 22, cross runway 18, cross runway 13 left. The taxi clearance must be read back fully. In the example, you would read back Texan 737, cleared to the run-ups via Charlie, Sierra. After the run-ups, having requested further taxi, received a clearance. Texan 737, runway 13 right via Sierra, Charlie, 22, cross 18, cross 13 left. You will then hold short of 13 right. If you find yourself at an unfamiliar airfield, you can request progressive taxi. This may be especially useful at busy airports where the taxi environment requires full awareness. This will entail step-by-step instructions from the ground controller. If the airfield layout is unfamiliar to you, have the airport diagram open. Before moving on to taxi procedures, let's cover a few simple memory aids to help you throughout your flying career. During taxi, always visually verify your location as you taxi throughout the airfield. Having the airport diagram out during taxi is a must. You may notice some airfields have better maintained lighting and signage than others. You will eventually become comfortable with your home base and intrinsically know where you are based on repetition. However, you should continue to remain vigilant at all times, especially at night and when operating at unfamiliar locations. For taxiway signage, location signs are always yellow script on black background. A good memory technique is yellow on black is where you are at. In this example, you are on taxiway Delta. Black script on yellow background is a direction sign, directing you to that specific taxiway. A good memory technique is black on yellow, inform a fellow. In this same example, you are on Delta and approaching hotel taxiway, which will be off to your left. Taxiway to runway signs. Runway signs are always white script on a red background. A good technique is to generally treat these as stop signs. These runway signs will almost always have a hold short line associated with them. Again, do not cross a hold short line to enter a runway unless you have been instructed to cross that specific runway, cleared to take off from that runway, instructed to taxi along the runway, or instructed to line up and wait on that runway. Depending on airfield operations and local SOP, you may still have the lineman directing you from the parking spot as shown here. To begin taxiing, first ensure that you have completed the before taxi checklist and you are cleared by ground control to taxi. Prior to releasing the parking brake, be sure to clear all areas around you before taxiing. Ensure nozzle steering is engaged, release the parking brake, and add power as necessary to slowly move the aircraft. Above idle power may be required to get the aircraft initially moving, but generally speaking, once the aircraft is moving, idle power is sufficient to sustain an appropriate taxi airspeed. Use your rudders to maintain directional control and brakes as required to slow the aircraft to a stop. Avoid riding the brakes during taxi to prevent unnecessary wear. NATOPS cautions against stabilized ground operation with the propeller at 62 to 80% NP. NATOPS also warns that a failure of nose wheel steering may prevent you from being able to change nose wheel direction without disengaging nose wheel steering. If this happens, disengage nose wheel steering and use differential braking for directional control. Do not continue to taxi if directional control problems arise. It is important to comply with SOP speed restrictions. The most important requirement is to maintain safe, positive control of your aircraft. Taxi speeds should be limited to 5 to 7 knots in the line, similar to a walking pace, and 10 to 12 knots outside the flight line, mimicking a trotting pace. Here's a demonstration of the different taxi speeds. In the T6B, turns are normally executed utilizing nose wheel steering by applying rudder in the desired direction of the turn. Tighter turns can be made by applying a slight amount of brake pressure on the rudder pedal of which the turn is being commenced. To prevent unnecessary wear, disengage nose wheel steering prior to differential braking turns. After executing the turn, re-engage the nose wheel steering by activating the switch prior to applying the opposite rudder to straighten the nose wheel. Failure to do so may result in nose wheel steering not engaging. Braking while taxiing. When taxiing, you must be careful of how you apply the brakes. Excessive braking in a turn can cause rapid acceleration in the turn rate and cause the aircraft tires to skid. Too little braking will cause increased taxi speeds and cause a wider turn radius. Always use a smooth, even application of the brakes, which will become second nature with practice. It is important to know that strong winds striking the tail surface may cause the aircraft to weather vane into the wind, causing the upwind wing to rise. To combat this, use aileron into the wind to lower the wing. Also, utilize forward stick to combat strong tailwinds. When taxiing, it is your responsibility as a pilot to maintain a 360-degree lookout for any traffic or obstacles. If performing a checklist during taxi, it is important to accomplish only one item at a time. That way you can maintain awareness of the obstacles that might hinder your taxi. Additionally, ensure you are monitoring the radio to keep aware of other aircraft movements or possible changes to your taxi instructions. Be sure to maintain proper spacing behind other aircraft in accordance with your local SOP. If no local guidance is providing, maintaining 150 feet behind another aircraft is a good rule of thumb to ensure safety while taxiing. When approaching the active runway, switch to tower frequency 200 feet prior to the hold short. Do not cross the hold short line. As you switch frequencies, listen carefully to avoid cutting out any other transmissions prior to making your departure request. When ready for takeoff, call tower utilizing the standard radio call and acknowledge all instructions provided by tower in the readback. You must always read back clearances whether you are cleared for takeoff, line up and wait, or hold short. It's important to keep in mind the three major wind limitations of the T6. Maximum crosswind component for a dry runway is 25 knots, maximum crosswind component for a wet runway is 10 knots, and maximum crosswind component for an icy runway is 5 knots. For the T6, there are two types of takeoff options, static takeoffs and rolling takeoffs. Either may be conducted depending on your training command's local procedures. However, the majority of your takeoffs in primary will be static. For a static takeoff, once cleared for takeoff, begin to taxi into position to line up on runway centerline and come to a complete stop noting their wind direction. Complete the lineup checklist and verify the nose wheel steering is disengaged. Hold the brakes, set the PCL to 30% torque, pull back on the control stick to a neutral position, maintaining any necessary crosswind inputs, and verify the engine instruments. Once this is done, release the brakes and smoothly move the PCL to max within 2 to 3 seconds. Anticipate the need for right rudder as the engine spools up and maintain directional control with rudder. Due to the high performance of the T6, locate a reference point at the end of the runway to ensure proper tracking of runway centerline throughout the takeoff roll. As the aircraft gains airspeed down the runway, continue to use rudder as necessary to maintain runway centerline. At 60 knots, verbalize current torque setting and verify proper fuel flow utilizing the following response. 60 knots, 100%, good flow. At 90 knots, apply gradual backstick pressure and position the nose to takeoff attitude approximately 8 degrees nose high. Allow the aircraft to fly itself off the deck. Before we move on to rolling takeoffs, let's quickly review rotation speed. The rotation speed for the T6 Bravo is 90 knots. If gusty wind conditions are present, we'll increase the rotate speed by half of the gust factor up to 10 knots. What is gust factor? Here's an example. If the current winds are reported with a steady magnitude of 10 knots and gusting up to 22 knots, the gust factor would be the difference between the max gust and our steady state value. In this case, 12 knots. Applying that equation, our new rotation speed with a gust factor of 12 will be half of that, 6 knots, plus the 90 equals rotation speed of 96 knots. Rolling takeoffs in the T6 are performed similarly to a static takeoff and are used to aid traffic flow in a busy traffic pattern. To perform a rolling takeoff, once cleared for takeoff, maneuver the aircraft onto runway centerline as you complete the lineup checklist. Once on centerline, with the lineup checklist complete, smoothly advance the PCL to max position and begin the takeoff roll. The torque effect of the T6 will cause the aircraft to swerve if the PCL is moved too aggressively. Due to this effect, it's important to always advance the PCL smoothly and with a consistent pace. It may help to verbalize your 2 to 3 second count as you add power. The torque effect will also cause the aircraft to move to the left. It is important to use right rudder as necessary throughout the takeoff roll to maintain runway centerline. To maintain directional control, use smooth, positive corrections with rudder, correcting back towards the centerline. As speed increases, the flight controls will become more effective, and you will generally need smaller rudder deflections to maintain centerline. During the takeoff roll, make sure to keep your heels on the floor and feet off of the brakes. We only utilize brakes if the decision is made to abort the takeoff. Using the brakes during the takeoff roll will cause slower acceleration and may cause severe swerving, brake lockup, blown tires, or possibly a brake fire. Remember, brakes are for stopping, not for steering when on the takeoff roll. Directional controls will need to be consistently held before and after rotation. Ensure the wings are straight and level, or you may find yourself in a rapid or unplanned roll. We'll discuss crosswind inputs later in this module. Ensuring a proper pitch attitude of 8 degrees nose high, the aircraft will lift itself off the runway. If too much backstick is utilized, it may cause a situation where there is an excessively high pitch attitude, which may result in a loss of lift, causing the aircraft to settle back onto the runway. If too little backstick is used, the airplane may also settle back down the runway due to insufficient lift. Stick with your FDI procedures, and it'll keep you in a proper climb attitude. During the initial climb out, it's important to establish 2 positive rates of climb prior to raising the landing gear and flaps. To do so, we'll reference the altitude and the VSI to confirm those rates. Call out 2 positive rates gear and raise the gear. Upon reaching 110 knots, call above 110 flaps and raise the flaps. Adjust pitch as necessary to climb between 140 and 180 knots. Crosswind takeoffs require additional control inputs to maintain centerline and a wings level attitude. First, observe the wind direction. Locate a nearby windsock to visually confirm the wind direction and approximate speed. Crosswinds will cause the aircraft to do one of 2 things: weather vane into the wind, or cause the upwind wing to rise and produce a skipping motion. During the skipping motion, the aircraft will move sideways, causing undue stress on the landing gear and tires. The primary hazard associated with this is the possibility of losing directional control of the aircraft. Torque and P factor will mitigate right crosswind weather vaning, but will aggravate left weather vane if the crosswinds are from the left. To combat these effects, use rudder effectively to maintain directional control and to counter the tendency of the aircraft to weather vane. Use sufficient right rudder to counter these effects. The key to maintaining centerline during a crosswind is to look long and stay focused on the aim point during the takeoff roll. If the nose tracks left of the reference point, add right rudder. If it moves right of the reference point, use left rudder. Another aspect of the takeoff roll on a crosswind is recognizing the tendency for the upwind wing to rise. The way to counter this is by holding the proper amount of aileron into the wind. At low speeds, more aileron input will be needed to counteract crosswinds. As their speed increases, gradually reduce the aileron input for a smooth transition down the runway. In summary, it is very important to understand that insufficient control input may cause the aircraft to lose directional stability and cause the aircraft to depart the prepared surface. A good understanding of the factors which affect the T6B on takeoff, as well as applying smooth and positive inputs, will reduce the likelihood of an unplanned yaw or an uneven attitude during the takeoff and rotation. Chairfly these procedures and reviewing supplemental material will help reinforce these concepts throughout your training. This concludes the Taxi and Takeoff module. All of the information is covered more thoroughly in the reading material. I encourage you to re-watch this module to help understand the concepts, review the study material, and understand that you can always have the option to seek out an instructor as needed.